Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature of which we are a part, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment, I want to welcome all of you to our session today of Humanity Rising as we contemplate the critical issue of leadership in our time. We traditionally think of leadership as the person at the top of the pyramid in a hierarchical order in which power and influence and decisions emanate from the top down. But our world has turned that upside down. We are in code red for climate. We're in code red for democracy. We're in code red for war and geostrategic balance. And the leaders that are at the top of the pyramid aren't leading and have either succumbed to incompetence or confusion or ineptitude and corruption. But as the global situation continues to spin out of control, the institutions that have guided us are no longer effectuating the kind of decision-making structures that we need to solve our global problems. So right at the moment when we need leadership the most, we, the people of the world, are having to take it upon ourselves to discern leadership. And if you think about the magnitude of the problems and challenges confronting us, this task of what leadership means in a world of hypercomplexity where the institutions are failing to lead is probably the most fundamental challenge confronting the human race at this moment. And when you factor in the reality that we're running out of time to make the kind of decisions necessary to bring about an abundant, healthy, vital future for our children, you have a measure of the critical importance of the matter that we're going to be dealing with today, which is the second day of a 4-day program on what is conscious leadership and can conscious leadership do what is necessary in our time. Before we jump into this very deep and complex domain, let us pause, as we always do, as we begin our Humanity Rising sessions. And in the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of nature, let us just center ourselves in our bodies. Our bodies are nature. And let us attune ourselves with our hearts and close our eyes if we can. And for the next minute, let us feel ourselves and just hold the question, how can we lead? Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude, I am very pleased to introduce to you two colleagues and good friends who've been so instrumental in building up Humanity Rising. We're convening our 499th session today. Tomorrow will be our 500th session since May 22nd, 2020. That we've convened Humanity Rising as we have been traversing the pandemic and world events. And so I want to bring in Tom Eddington, the founder and CEO of Endangered Global, and George Cappannelli, the founder and CEO of Age Nation, who have jointly collaborated on a number of programs. Last week on the youth of our world in crisis, and this week on conscious leadership. So gentlemen, welcome. I thank you so much and turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always a pleasure. In a few moments, Tom and I'll have the privilege of introducing some wonderful guests today, and we're really delighted for their presence. Before we do, I want to say a few words and also ask Tom if he'll do a little bit of a overview on conscious leadership from his perspective. As I was listening to Jim, finding myself shaking my head and agreeing completely with the abysmal state of leadership in so many parts of the world and in so many different institutions today. But I also realized that as this old story, this top-down story dies, it gives us, we the people, a remarkable opportunity. And it's one that I hope we're capable and willing to take both seriously and accept. And that is that in the new story, while leaders, individual leaders, need to play an important part, it is time that we in consciousness, I believe, step forward and take on our role. We can't depend anymore exclusively on somebody riding the white horse in and leading us to victory. The victory now, if it's going to be achieved, belongs to all of us. And that's part of the new story for me. And I hope that as we go through the remainder of this week and going forward, thinking about conscious leadership, we think very closely about what is it that we need to do individually to be much more conscious and to play our part in that process. I think if we can take the words of Peter Finch from Network to heart, I think it is time for us to get up, to go over and open our doors and our windows and stick our heads out and yell, I've had enough and I'm not going to take it anymore. Because that's the thing. Ultimately, I think if we have a chance at saving our democracy, at saving humanity and the species and this dastardly distressed habitat that we're living on, we, the people, need to play an important role. Tom, a little more on conscious leadership, please.
Sure, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction, and thank you as always, George. It's great collaborating with you. So the title of today's program is "Conscious Leadership to the Rescue?" ? And the reason for that, and just a little bit of history. A former business partner of mine, good friend and colleague, John Renish, coined the term conscious leadership in the late 1980s. And at the same time, almost to the month, there was a gentleman in Atlanta, Georgia, who came up with the term conscious leadership. Neither one of them knew about it for about 15 or 20 years after the coining of the term. But the belief by John and his counterpart was that there was a different kind of leadership that was needed in the world. And they both independently coined this term conscious leadership and then set about writing books and really trying to define conscious leadership. And I'll just bring in a couple of other dimensions that make this relevant with the question mark of, is conscious leadership truly the answer to and the antidote to the world's problems? Around the same time, or a bit predating it, was a lot of work around what's called spiral dynamics and looking at human consciousness and the evolution of human consciousness. And there's a model that talks about and defines tier 1 and tier 2 consciousness. And the level of the complexity of the problems that the world's facing today, whether it's environmental, social, et cetera, requires a different kind of consciousness to address these problems. The old consciousness that created these problems can't solve for the problems that we have. And if I look at our, the way that the world at a meta level operates, we have the needs of nature. We have the needs of society. We have the needs of business, and things have to be economically feasible. And then we have our political systems. And they're in opposition with each other rather than working in collaboration. And the needs of business have outgrown and outsized the needs of society and the environment, at the expense of society and at the expense of nature. And in his encyclical in 2015, Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si, that connected for the first time in a beautiful way societal needs, societal justice with the needs of nature. And we're at this point now where our political systems and our economic systems, and what John Perkins calls our Frankenstein capitalism, have decimated the needs of society and the needs of nature. And that has to come back into balance. Our political systems, our economic systems, with the needs of nature and society. And there's been a lot of writing, a lot of research that conscious leadership holds the promise of helping bring that back into balance. And that's part of what we want to explore today.
So let's begin by bringing in our wonderful guests. Joyce Hope Scott. Joyce, will you turn on your video, please? Is a clinical professor of African American Studies at Boston University. She's a national, international scholar, lecturer in African American and Diaspora Studies. She's a former scholar of the Oxford Round Table and former Fulbright senior lecturer and researcher to the republics of Burkina Faso and Benin in West Africa. She's also the coordinator of a group called International Network for Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. Joyce, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. We're also joined by Dr. Ferguson Cuff, as he's like to be known. He has been the president or co-president of the Association of Humanistic Psychology for many years, making history in 2006 as the first African American and first person of color to be president of this national association. He's a tenured professor and former dean at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, currently serves as Human Services Program Director and Human Services Internship Coordinator, and he's the co-founder of two visionary organizations, Interculture, Inc. and Associates in Human Understanding. He, like Joyce, is a well-known author, and delightful to have you here today too, Cuff. Celeste Kruger is the founder and president of Celeste Kruger Associates, a leadership and organizational development firm dedicated to helping people name their purpose and deliver it with passion. Celeste and I have had the privilege of working together for a number of years and making as much trouble in a number of different organizations as we could over that time. Tom?
Welcome, all of you. And I'll introduce Dr. Dean Anderson. Dean's a personal friend and a co-member of an organization I co-founded, the Conscious Leadership Guild. He's an author, business leader, and has done some extraordinary work around human development and bringing that into organizations, whether it's some incredible work he's done with the Toronto Police Force and many corporations and other organizations around the world. He's been at it for decades now and has some incredible work he's going to be putting together to allow it to scale and for other individuals and organizations to use his decades of work to help elevate human consciousness and change some of the institutions and systems that we're all part of and suffering from.
So, Tom, why don't you start it off with one of your questions?
Sure. So, Dean, I'll start with you. A question: how do you define conscious leadership, and how have you brought it into the Toronto Police Force and some of the organizations that you've had a opportunity to work with? You're muted.
You're muted, Dean. There you go.
That's okay. That was just hot air to get that out. Tom, just for the record, the police force that you're actually speaking about is called York Regional Police, and they're in the Toronto area. So I just want everybody to know that in case you're looking at Toronto Police Force. And then the chief's mad at me, right? For me, conscious leadership, wow, there's so many pieces to this. You know, our body of work we call conscious change leadership. So I'll just insert this idea straight away. For me, the conscious part of that is humans who wake up from the inside out and realize they have a mindset. And we all have a mindset, and that mindset's interpreting what we experience 24/7, 365, and everything we see in the world is based on that interface between the fact and our own interpretive system. So if I'm not awake that I have an interpretive system, then I always think that what I see is actually true. It's never true in terms of capital T true. It's my experience of truth. And if I don't know that, then I can't get to the next step, which is to realize that my mindset has an impact because it determines how I see things. Therefore, the decisions I make, the feelings I have, the thoughts I have, the actions I take, the results I get. Well, if I don't know that I'm actually impacting the world with my mindset, then I'm unconsciously just putting me on the world, and I'm only going to get the results that my unconscious aspects of my mindset allow me to get. But if I want breakthrough, and we're in red, we need breakthroughs, I've got to wake up to my interior so I can begin to actually navigate, build self-awareness in myself, and I can manage my interior, I can change my interior and alter the way I see the world when I've got these biases that just get in the way of what we need in the world. And then I can be operating from a place of mastery. So that's conscious. The change part for me is all about making a difference in the world. And we're talking about leadership, but if I don't have the know-how of transformation, then I can have the desire for change and I can have the will and the resources, but 70% of change efforts in large organizations fail. And that fail rate has been true for about 25 years and it's been researched heavily for those 2.5, 3 decades. Why do we keep failing? Because we don't know as a society and as a body of leaders how to transform. So we've got the need to wake up. We've got the need to know how to transform ourselves, our relationships, our teams, our organizations, our communities, our world, our systems. But we also need to lead. And what is lead? And in the world of today, lead is helping others unleash their own human potential. So old leadership is different than management. Management's all about managing the things. Leadership is seeing the future and having the answer, being the smart person in the room. The new form of leadership is what we would call co-creative leadership, where I'm facilitating processes by which other people can contribute their wisdom, and we are aligned to co-create the positive future that we want. So for me, it's really about conscious change leadership, because I think without the know-how, knowing about the new models of leadership is sorely inadequate.
So, Cuff, Joyce, Celeste, conscious leadership for you and how you're dealing with it with your clients or your students or the institutions that you're a part of.
Do I go? Okay. I think that a couple of things I'd like to put out there. One of them is I'm not sure that we are talking about transformation in terms of individuals who are going to lead us into some sort of broader vision. I like the idea, the notion of Ubuntu, which is a notion that is very African in its perspective. And the idea is that it's a collection of values and practices that people, I would say not only African people, but indigenous people have used throughout time, based on values and so on, from the lowest peasant to the king. They're all operating traditionally, and I don't mean just Africans, I mean traditional people typically operating and moving to a vision that is about harmony. Another word may be ma'at, which is an Egyptian word, about harmony, about reciprocity, about unity, and respect, most importantly. This kind of leadership is based on consensus. I saw it in operation, let's say, in the structure of the Togonas in the Sahel of Mali or Niger and so on. They're sort of low, flat type of buildings. And the men, these people tend to be very, very tall, 6'6" or 7. And everybody sits there. Nobody can jump up in anger, because if they do, they bump their heads on the top of the Togona. So that's it. That ensures that no one will move until a consensus has been reached. And therefore that type of leadership of, let's say, that group of elders or of people, which might in some societies include women also, will come to a decision based on the fact that they represent constituencies in the community. That I think that's what we're missing, and which has to be at the front and center of conscious reform in leadership. That we have to recognize that there are different publics, I'll use that term, and can any one person, or the way we've had leadership emerge so far, has not recognized and accepted the idea of the different publics and so on. Martin Luther King talked about the beloved community because he thought that we could actually build a beloved community, and we could just look at the way he was selected as a leader, somebody who just came into a community, a young 25-year-old person, and the community, based on the notion of Ubuntu, says, okay, you are a person that can represent what we want to say, because you are articulate, you have the degrees, you are young, you are vibrant, and all these other kinds of things. And it's a consensus that launched a leader, a person who took the role of leadership. But it was always a group, always a committee that did the leadership. I think we need to get back to that, which two things I will say that I'm working on in INOSAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists, and that is the notion of rematriation and planet repairs. And I'm going to stop pretty much there and maybe say something a little later on with other questions.
Thank you, Joyce. Cuff?
All right, thank you. Actually, I was going to let Celeste talk because it's the Southern gentleman in me.
Well, that is very kind of you, sir, but I yield the chair.
Well, let me say that when I think about the subject of conscious leadership, for me, it also ties in with some things that Joyce has been talking about, and we had a previous interchange. And she said, "How do you want to tackle this?" And I said, "Well, why don't we do this through the lens of Ubuntu, and talk about what some of our experiences have been." So I just wanted to say this in a slightly different way. You know, one of the things that occurs to me is that I've been working on what I call the evolution of consciousness. And where that has taken me is to look very deep into what is consciousness all about. Now, Jung gave us the term the collective unconscious, and I've been promoting the idea of a collective consciousness, which also stems from Ubuntu. So collective consciousness, however, means that we're all aspects, unique aspects of this collective consciousness. In that light, one then thinks about what does it mean to be a part of a group consciousness, and how do you operationalize yourself within the context of a group consciousness? Well, when I go there, I ask myself the question of, when you think about a group, basically it boils down to 4 roles that people can play in a group. You may find people who are movers. You may find people who are actually followers. You may find people who are opposers. And you also may find people who are bystanders. Now, in my mind, actually, in this collective consciousness, you can lead from any of these positions consciously, if you're conscious about the role that you're playing. Each of these roles has an upside and a downside. If you're a mover, what you're basically engaged in is consciously initiating things. The downside of being a mover is that you take up a lot of airtime. So there's no bandwidth for anybody else. If you are a follower, you can lead from that position too, because the followers basically embrace a vision, and they are the actors. They're the people that carry things out. But the downside of being a follower is that you can follow blindly. And then you can be an opposer. Now, the upside of being an opposer is to slow processes down and say, hey, wait a minute. Are we taking a look at everything we need to take a look at? Let's consider all of the possibilities. And the downside, of course, of an opposer is that they may get involved with ego tripping and oppose just for the sake of opposing, because they want to do some status stuff. Bystanders, you can also lead from that position too. Bystanders tend to be the observers. That's the upside. They watch. They don't say a lot, but when they speak, people listen because their observations tend to bring things together. They provide a context for what they've been listening to. And of course, the downside of being a bystander is that you opt out, you withdraw. So being a conscious leader, for me anyway, is being aware that you're part of this collective consciousness, and that you can play your role in a variety of different ways consciously from any of these 4 positions. But you have to be aware that you're doing it and very conscious about the fact that you're doing it. Anyway, I'll stop there. I have a lot more to say about the other aspects of it.
Yeah, thank you, Cuff. Celeste?
Thanks, Tom. All of you, thank you. What a beautiful framework woven together already. You make it very easy for me to step in because I don't have to say a lot of things. You've said them. I've been thinking about this a lot in recent months since the world has started fraying at the edges so quickly. I mean, it's always been frayed. But I find myself in the work I'm doing and in my own private life, probably even more importantly. Recognizing that even the phrase conscious leadership sometimes makes me oddly amused, because it implies that any one of us has the capacity to truly be conscious. It's almost an oxymoron. We've all, each of you has spoken to, and I will as well, the interior landscape for which we're responsible, our need to recognize we have blind spots, but how do we know what we don't know? Unless we put ourselves in a context of Ubuntu. I can't wait, Joyce. I want to hear more about the rematriation work you're doing. My instincts tell me that there's something there for all of us, because there's no way for me to know all of my biases unless I surround myself with people who are trustworthy, responsible, intentional, making choices to say, I'm showing up authentically and with integrity, and I'm going to give you feedback. And then I have to welcome that. Because if I don't, how could I possibly call myself a leader? It's not doable. So I think these days a lot about what is embodied leadership. For me, that's a conscious kind of leadership. It's closer to the bone. How does that relate to my cells in my body as nature? How have I created? And what are my impacts around me, on people, on the earth, on the animals I live with? And by what myths am I gauging my choices? I'm feeling a need and watching around me a grave need we have to go back to the old myths, the early myths, the origin myths, whatever they are for us. I know this is more abstract than some of the conceptual frameworks that each of you laid out, and I'm grateful you did because it gives me the freedom to go here. But I'm thinking a lot these days about a phrase Clarissa Pinkola Estes in the early days with Women Who Run with the Wolves used. She talked about la que sabe, the woman who knows even in the dark. I think we need, as leaders and as people teaching other leaders how to do that well, to go to the interior and to ask, how do I learn to see what I do not know about my own limitations so that I can be of service? I think that's what I have to say for now.
I'm, like as Celeste said, I'm grateful to each of you for the framing that you're providing for this dialogue today. And while each of you have been speaking, there's a question that has been coming up in my mind over and over again. And that is, it seems to me that no matter what the form of leadership, it's evolutionary in process. It takes a while to be understood and then to be implemented in various ways. And especially when we talk about this kind of understanding of the interior and the questions that each of us need to address to ourselves, or the roles, Cuff, that each of us can play in the evolution of consciousness in general. And we are living at a time that some of you have already described as code red. I call it in extremis, which is a nautical term. When a ship is heading toward collision, running aground or capsizing, the rules of the road, the navigational rules of the road at sea are abandoned, and the crew and the captain need to do whatever is necessary to save the ship. So my question is, in extremis, in code red, how does this concept of conscious leadership, whether it's individual in nature or collective, how does it save the ship? What has to happen for us to avoid collision or running aground or capsizing at this time in our history?
Well, I think that if we go back to some basic principles of Ubuntu again, The idea is it asserts that society gives human beings their humanity, not an individual posture, but the society that one is involved in. One is I am because I'm a part of humanity, or he or she is human, therefore I am. The idea of rematriation is that we have removed ourselves from being a part of a larger, more significant relational situation with the rest of the creation, the environment, even societies, even our communities. We have moved ourselves into little silos. We've othered other people, people that are human beings like us. We, in order to build the society we have today, the greatest society in the world, or whatever it is we live in, as we call it, or the northern world or western world, whatever term we have, we transgressed a lot of things at the spiritual and human level. In fact, we transgressed humanity, and we've been living without humanity. Rematriation invites us to go back and figure out what it is we've left in order to try to become human again, to know what is that, to accept the fact that there are spiritual parts of us. I won't say aspiritual, but there are spiritual levels of us, 8 according to traditional healers. And thus, because we never address those things, they say we'll never heal ourselves. Is it you don't heal anybody over there, because you only deal with 3 dimensions, of man, and they're 8 or whatever. Rematriation invites us to figure out what are they. And there is something, there is a place we have to go, maybe to humble ourselves, to look again at indigenous knowledge, at that which is quote unquote backward, dangerous, or unimportant, and all those other kinds of things, because it's the root of where we've come from. So how do we do that? And it's like a tree. I mean, you lift as you climb. This is a motto that women in the women's club movement of the 19th century, from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to people like Ida B. Wells, you lift as you climb. You never move without pulling somebody up. That is to say, you always know that you are connected to something bigger than yourself. Or comments like, the service, that is conscious service or conscious leadership or conscious contribution, is the rent we pay for this earth, that the space we take up on this earth. It's not for free. We pay something for it. And understanding how to in fact, it's like anything else. What's this worth? Or when you're in an old traditional society bargaining, you try to figure out, the seller will say, okay, this is worth so much. And you'll say, well, no, I want to give you this. And eventually you keep haggling, I'll say, back and forth until you come to an amount that you both agree is worthy of the thing that's to be sold. What is our soul worth? What is our society's soul worth? And that has to outweigh, that has to come before, in a conscious position of leadership, whether it's and I believe personally that cannot happen with one person. This idea of the Lone Ranger leader who springs up, whole, like Athena from the head of Zeus or whatever, already empowered with this knowledge, is just a myth. We don't have that. We need today, especially more than anything else, we need everybody. We need to listen to children. We talk about the children who were hurt, but we haven't talked to the children themselves. Okay, this is conscious leadership. We don't know where to go until we figure out what the direction is. There must be a vision. And that vision, indeed, of all great leaders have had a vision. And that vision is something that the leader, if we use an individual, or the group of leaders, the group of elders or whatever, whoever they are, whether they're kids or whether they're elderly people, have to be able to, quote unquote, sell that vision to the society for the better well-being of society. Conscious leadership today, I'm afraid, is not, in my estimation, is not something that can happen individually. because there's too much to be considered. That is why rematriation, that's why it all has to do with planet repairs. Planet repairs is not just an environmental thing. We get distracted by the green people who are talking green or whatever, with these sound bites of what it is. It is a holistic notion that we belong to something greater than ourselves, and that implies that there's no such thing as an other where people are concerned. Everybody is implicated in that. A great leader or leaders or contingencies of leaders will understand that, that how much have we missed? How much greatness have we missed? How many cures for cancer have we missed because we've othered people who cannot enter the conversation? This is rematriation. This is a part of rematriation. Finding out and going back, not repatriation, not going back to the landscape, and maybe that as well, but rematriation is something spiritual. Before we dismantled our spirituality, it is the thing we have to go back and find. That is conscious leadership at its best. And as we operate as twins, as the idea of the twin parents or creators, whatever, we also must think in terms of the other. There can be no objectification of someone else who is a human being, because we have to work together to save, without being on the soapbox. I don't want to get on the soapbox here, but in order to save and to undo the mess that we've created, we do need all hands on deck, to use your ship analogy again, in my mind. That's a part of rematriation for sure. Revalorization of those traditional things. How can revalorize those cultural things, those spiritual communal things that helped our people, the people before us, who made changes, great changes in a very dangerous society that we lived in. People who made those changes, what did they do? How did they connect? That's the rematriation part of it anyway. So I'll stop there and maybe say more later. Thank you.
Yeah, just
to chime in a little bit, and I just wanted to be to provide a context of what Joyce is also referring to, and I'll just use a personal example just to illustrate how things can happen without, if you're a child, for example, without you actually knowing it happening until later on. And I'm just going to use an example just to illustrate how Ubuntu actually affected my life without my even knowing it affecting my life until later. And this is just an experience where, I grew up in the South, and it was an all-Black community because it's a segregated South. But a lot of things were centered around the Black church. Now, at the age of 13, these deacons of this church came to me and they said, "We want you to be superintendent of Sunday school." And I said, "But I'm only 13. And they said, "Oh, we think you can do it. And we want your brother, who's 14, to be the secretary of the Sunday school." I went, whoa. Now, what they were practicing at that point was Ubuntu. They didn't use that word, but it had been passed down generationally across continents into that experience of these deacons coming to me and saying that. They had a certain kind of level of consciousness saying, we see potential here. We want to nurture that. And we want to put you in a position. Here I was, 13 years old, serving as a superintendent of a Sunday school, teaching adult classes in a Sunday school to all these adults and what have you. Of course, I had a little, and I was mimicking a lot, but I was also practicing Ubuntu. Now also, so that stuck inside of me. and led a lot to the ways in which I carry out myself in the world and things that I've embodied. But at the time, I didn't know that I was being exposed to it. And I suspect that the deacons didn't know that they were practicing it. And the point I'm trying to make here is that consciousness, when in fact you embody something, you can carry out impactful activities, impactful ways of working without necessarily having the words to do that. So I, for example, talk about the idea that we simultaneously live in 3 life spaces: a personal life space, a societal life space, and a global life space. Now, if my consciousness goes to the global, which often it does, I can get very overwhelmed with all that needs to be done. If my consciousness goes to the societal life space, I can also get overwhelmed with all that needs to be done. So you ask yourself the question then, where can you feel empowered to make a difference? And it's actually operationalized through your personal life space. That is the people, the circumstances, the situations that you expose yourself to or invite into your awareness. And you form actions along with others through this spirit of Ubuntu to make a difference. So I've been involved with numerous kinds of activities, founding certain kinds of organizations, so forth. But all of that happened in my personal life space. It is the people, events, and circumstances that I was aware of and that I was trying to make a difference with. Now, ultimately, that all adds up. Because indeed, if every single person actually led or came from that position, each person would be empowered to do something in their personal life space. And it's out of that empowerment then that we do indeed impact on the societal and the global. When you try to take it from this global aspect, and we do have to be aware of it, sometimes people get into this space of not feeling that they can make a difference or acting. And from my perspective then, in order to actually feel like you're going to be making a difference and getting the feedback around it, that will happen in your personal life space. Now, all of us on this panel right here, for example, play a variety of different roles, have been in many different kinds of settings. And we may say to ourselves that we're working on a global issue or a societal issue or what have you, but that's happening in your personal life space. And we're making a difference. So for me, then, that's empowerment that comes through, and that's leadership that comes through out of the interior that Celeste was talking about. That interior space then comes with us. we cannot get away from our interior. So it's like working from your interior in your personal life space to matter and make a difference there. Recognizing that by doing so, one is also making a difference in the societal life space and the global life space. If one maintains that perspective, my suggestion is that people will not begin to feel overwhelmed, like I can't do anything.
Dean, you've been quiet for a while. I see you shaking your head. What's going on?
Just, the way my head works, George, is I kind of get my mind as big as I can so I can have a container for all the different perspectives that are being spoken and see where the integration is, because I know there's profound integration, and that's usually where the juice is. And that's always influenced by my own perspective. So I'm just putting all that together inside. What's coming up for me is it's a yes and, right? I really hear what Joyce and Cuff are saying. And then my add on the and, I guess it comes from my unique perspective. I started my career coming right out of graduate school, and I founded an institute called the Optimal Performance Institute. And what we did there was basically teach how to get in the flow. What's the flow state? And how do you set up the conditions in a somatic, energetic mindset way so that you can tune into being where flow emerges and be a high performer, whatever you're doing, whether you're a singer on stage or a basketball player or an Olympic athlete, and all those people came to the Institute with miraculous successes. And what happened for me is I realized I got thrown into a corporate setting working with a team. And I realized that teams actually are either enablers or limiters to individual performance. You never lose your own self, as Cuff is beautifully saying. You bring it with you, but there's a dynamic around team. And as I began to, over a number of years, learn about how teams develop and up-level their collective consciousness and make collective agreements about how they want to be together and what they want to co-create, that could create breakthroughs that the aggregate of the 7 or 10 or 15 people, it was bigger than that. 1 + 1 = 3 or 5. Once the team coalesced and operated from those same qualities of being as when we're in our own flow. Then I realized that organizations had their own culture that stifled those high-performing teams. So then I got very interested in meeting and falling in love with my partner, who was one of the gurus in organizational change, that we could actually up-level cultures if we understood how a larger collective actually worked. And so for me, my life work has been in the boardroom with CEOs of some of the biggest corporations on the planet, including places like NATO, right? Working with a second in charge of NATO. These are big, complex systems. So I'm with Cuff very much around saying we bring all the dimensions of self, relationship, team, organization, community, planet with us at all times. And fundamentally, conscious leadership starts with me, the individual, no matter what my role is or who I am. And then I can be in a way in my area of influence where I can make a difference by how I be, how I relate, how I work, how I show up. And if I'm conscious of that and I'm tapped into my own flow, there's a natural way I want to be, which is I want to serve. I want to help. And the vision that I heard Joyce talking about, for me, out of that place of being at that higher state of consciousness that I can step into at any moment in time, because it always exists. And it's only unavailable to me because I make it unavailable because I'm operating from my ego. And I don't know how, back to the know-how, to drop in beyond my ego's voices and concerns and worries and fears and doubts and tap into that heart in myself that says, I want to serve, I want to make a difference, I want to help. So I got to do that no matter who I am. And then there are people that have bigger roles. I watched a client in a Fortune 100 company who was a football coach transform football in his community to make it about kids, boys and girls across the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender, working together as collaborators to bring out their best expression in a game called football. Wow, that changed families' lives because it influenced how parents related to their kids back at home. I got a call yesterday from an executive, top 10 people in one of the world's biggest corporations. He said, I wanted you to be one of the first to know I'm leaving. Wow, why are you leaving, man? You got this big job, you got all this influence. He says, I can't change the world enough from inside the confines of this corporation. I need to be out in the world, bringing my mastery of leadership into a bigger impact. Okay, what I'm saying there is that executive who is a football coach And anybody else on the planet has a way of being that we can cultivate in our own consciousness that naturally says, how do I serve? And so for me, while I might get overwhelmed at the planetary level, for me, I don't. I'm all about community in the planetary level at this point. Now, 40 years ago when I started because I was interested in conscious evolution. That was the pursuit. I had no idea how to change myself, let alone a team, an organization, or a society. But 40 years later, we've been building a system that does that. And what I'm going to leave with is simply the idea that we all got to find our place. And if we're a leader out there like that executive that wants to make a bigger difference, or we're a consultant, or we're a coach, or we're a facilitator, let's look at how we do it. And let's never forget that if we're not doing it on ourselves, if we're not doing our own therapy, if we're not sitting on our meditation pillow or doing our spiritual practices, we are not cultivating the consciousness that is uniquely channeled through us as a part of the collective system called life, Gaia, collective consciousness, CUF. If we're not doing that, then anything we do in our role is going to be limited by our lack of working on ourselves. And simultaneously, let's learn how to change systems, because it's the systems of politics, inequity in our banking. We don't invest in poor neighborhoods. We have inequity in how we educate. We have inequity in our justice system. We have inequity because we other people. And so this society, not just in America, but across the planet, is uniquely built as simply a reflection of our collective consciousness. The outside is the inside. So we can work on the inside, but what happens too often is we forget we have to change the systems. And there's mechanisms to do that. So my invitation is often different than most speakers, is yes, and let's do the work on ourselves, and let's learn how to change systems, because there's methodology that's available that enables us to make a difference in that football team or that community, and make a difference in a corporation or a police force, and raise the quality of culture. So Ubuntu and the lack of othering, meaning co-creation, becomes a possibility. And that's what's up for me, George. And thanks for the opportunity to tune in and share.
Celeste?
Thanks, Tom. Dean, I love the phrase you used several times as you were wrapping up your response to George's invitation. You talk about a way of being. And like you, one of the things that happens for me, always has, it's just the way I work, is I'm listening for the overlaps in a dialogue like this. I'm reaching for synthesis and trying to hear in between the lines the quieter messages that may not be said in the words. So here's what I hear. I'm listening back, George, to your query 15 minutes ago. With the world and the state we find ourselves, the things we've done to each other, to ourselves, and to the planet, how do we exert leadership or demonstrate leadership in extremis? And then I go cuff to where you were a little while ago when you did this lovely, elegant job of characterizing 4 likely roles we might find in any group. And I want to say, like you did, Dean, around way of being, yes, and I find a 5th way of being in a group. And it goes like this. I might walk into a situation, any one of us listening, any one of us on this panel might walk into a group or a situation where there is a need for someone to hold the perimeter. No words involved, but a highly refined, grounded, non-reactive, quiet space that supports whoever it is that's in the foreground, in the lead, in the moment, that recognizes what's happening around the room, around the country, on the globe, and says, I am here to bring a peaceful, quiet, grounded presence into this roiling space, into this dialogue, into this conflict, for the purpose of supporting whoever is taking point at that moment. And in extremis, I remember the times in my life that I have had the experience of someone walking into a room, saying nothing, and the entire space changes. And I wonder if you've had that experience too. Because in the moments when we may not have words, or not all of us can be at the microphone, there is always a way to hold the circle. And that comes from ancient traditions. So I find myself feeling quite grateful right now and wanting to remind myself that even when I'm in the midst of masters, as I'm sitting with you this morning, there's still a place for having your back and being a different kind of ally than the world might recognize. It only comes from a spiritual place. That's a conduit that goes into ancient times before we even had form.
I just want to pick up on that last comment, Celeste, and thank you, and tie it back to something that Joyce said earlier and Dean picked up on as well. Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor's recent book published last year on the whole brain talks about our spirit. We have a spiritual brain, and it resides in the right hemisphere in the prefrontal cortex. And last week, Dr. Lisa Miller from Columbia University joined us on her decades work with research, working with twins and functional MRI studies to look at what's the impact of activating the spiritual brain. Where does the spiritual brain come from? And Dr. Miller talked about each of us are born with that physical spiritual brain in our prefrontal cortex in the right hemisphere. And it's about a third of our spirituality, and the other 2/3 comes from the environment that we reside in. And the importance of activating and developing that spiritual brain, particularly with youth and her research, the children who have a spiritual practice, who have developed their spirituality, do phenomenally well academically, do incredibly well socially, that they don't deal with some of the issues in our society around substance abuse and have psychological, emotional problems when they're developing that spiritual part of who they are. And so many of our organizations in our society, not just here in the US, we have removed that spiritual part of us. We haven't made space for, we haven't given permission to the spiritual part of us. And so many of the ills of our world are the absence of spirituality. So I just wanted to pick up on that piece of this conversation that each of you brought into it.
I'd love to quickly add to what you're saying from my perspective is, again, my work is in boardrooms of big, complex organizations. The name of our company is Being First. What does that mean? Put your being first if you want to be first. So in other words, whatever it is you're trying to create, be first, is you get there by putting being first. And being is our word simply for what you're saying. And the message is, if you're interested in being a transformational leader, your core superpower is the degree to which you can connect to being. Because when you connect to that, what you're calling spiritual part, and we use the word spirit out because then we get in all the religious stuff, right? Being is more neutral. Is that if you connect to your inner self, you find amazing things happen. Intuition opens up. Your listening skills naturally emerge. Your willingness to speak truth to power starts to develop because the fear of the repercussions of that lessen. And so those ego voices, we like to say, they don't necessarily go away in our journey to oneness with spirit, in our conscious evolution. They just become distant voices in the echo chamber of the past. And so for me, what you're saying is actually the heart of it. And then on top of that, the insight about how we change systems, where we look at something like politics or how we manufacture or our extractive resources, the way we do healthcare and everything else, we go, oh, it's just too big. Not if we sit still, and not if we listen to each other and do this co-creatively. So I just really want to echo what you're saying, because there's a downside of what's happening in the progressive part of our planet, which is we learn about it, what you're talking about, and then we think we have it, as opposed to we learn about it, and now we go into the room and seek our lifelong journey of discovering what it actually is. And that's, for me, the declaration to leaders, is that when we get a prospective call, sales call, if you will, in our organization, is always around, are you courageous enough to do your own personal work? Because without that, you are now limiting, as the leader, everything else that can happen in your organization. Because without the awakening of that spiritual brain, you're not releasing your own, let alone anybody else's human potential. So my hat is off to you for speaking what I believe is essentially a part of the solution.
I want to say that another way as well, and that is that we're talking about spiritual brain, and in many ways, as the good folks at HeartMath and Doc Childra have talked about, there is that heart brain. And when Jim started us off today, one of the things we talked about was heart-head coherence. And so I think that being that you're talking about, Dean, and the spiritual brain that you're referring to, Tom, have also something to do with making that what's been called the longest journey any of us can make, which is from our head to our hearts. And when we make that journey and when we make that connection, I think that focus on being, that focus on spirituality, that focus on service becomes naturally there, because it's impossible, in my personal experience, to make that connection between my head and my heart and not be present and not be committed to service. And Joyce, as you talked about, not eliminate that barrier to the other, because there's no other when I'm connected with my head and my heart. And perhaps we're answering that question. What do we do about Code Red? What do we do about In Extremis? We make the connection between head and heart. We focus on being, and maybe the changes that need to happen then become kind of a spontaneous manifestation that allows us to change systems and to eliminate the lunacy that we live by. At least that's one perspective. Other perspectives on this? Thank you.
I'll just jump in real quick and just tie some of Dean's comments back to where this conversation started. I mean, it really is as Joyce and Cuff were talking about, Ubuntu. We can do our inner work, but we have to have and as leaders, we have to create a sense of safety so that people can reflect back to us and we can actually hear what's being reflected back to us from those in our community, those that we're in relationship with. And that's a responsibility the leader has, to create that sense of safety and to be open and willing to get the feedback, to receive the gift that those that we're in relationship with have to offer us.
So should we, Joyce, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add a bit to both the comments that Tom and also Cuff made earlier about this sort of Ubuntu in terms of the responsibility to the community. I guess one of the things that Michael Onyebuchi talks about in terms of Ubuntu is this idea of collective responsibility. Part of the conscious leadership has to recognize collective responsibility, that what is good for me, yes, but what is good for the community, the recognition that one does not live alone. One is not on an island. It goes without saying, but the idea that the human subjectivity is an idea that we must recognize. It promotes the good of the community. If we've destroyed the community, or if we've alienated or left unembraced a part of the community, we are always negligent in our collective responsibility. We cannot build a collaborative or a consensus around collective responsibility. In this state of code red, I like the terms that people have thrown around here. We're definitely in code red. The idea is that everyone has a different strength, different skills. People are not to be isolated. We need to, in other words, give mutual support. It's a part of that responsibility. When Cuff talked earlier about the community where we grew up building, they knew they may not have articulated it, but it was pointed out to me that they were consciously building a product to put out. I hate to sound like the people, you know, they were building a widget or a widget, but they essentially were. You know, that's true. I remember that example that he gave. Oh, you're 12 now, you're smart, you know, you're bright, you're articulate, you can lead this group. You should lead the Sunday school lesson, or you should lead the drama lesson today, or whatever the case might be. And you figure, oh, why are they picking on me? But they're not actually picking on you. They want you to understand, they wanted us to understand you have a responsibility to something bigger than yourself. And because you have stepped out there, let's put it that way, quote unquote, with your marks, your high marks or whatever it is you've done, then yes, you've got this responsibility to the collective. So it's not about you. It could never be about you as an individual. No matter how you shine, you know, you might have been a shiner in the community, or you might have shone brightly or whatever. You had to give something back and be pulled back into the matriarchal, not matriarchal, but matriation, that whole business of that this is a communal effort, and this is who you are, this is where you come from. Don't forget it. My father would say to me all the time, yeah, okay, you've gone up there and you've gotten all those degrees and so on and so forth, but don't lose your mind and forget who you are, or whatever the case might be. Not that he wasn't proud. He was very proud, but he wanted me to understand, because of some of the decisions I was making that were so alien to what I grew up with. And what he was saying was, what have you been learning up there? What have they been teaching you there? You know, I thought you were going to get a superior education or whatever, but no, this is not working properly. It's that constant connection that we want to, I mean, I don't know, it certainly is different. I'm not saying that particular community was the ideal community or whatever, but it was a community. It was a group of people. It was that had a history, that had a common consciousness of struggle, of vision, of ideas, of how they wanted their children to be and perform. Other than just, you know, I don't know, the idea of teaching children, it's not just about lessons or about learning numbers or whatever, being superior in STEM or whatever. Where is the idea of collective responsibility, the community, and so on? And how can we do that? And I go back to the children again. I'm always concerned, because I feel, in other words, maybe I'm giving too much responsibility to them, but I believe in them. And they are essentially the ones I believe in, because they are still quote unquote saved from the fodder that the rest of us have fallen into. And we might be able to do something to make responsible and conscious leaders of them, if we are conscious about the fact that we're building these people to be collectively responsible for the environment, for themselves, for each other, and that all of them are made from the same ashe. It's not possible to separate and break people up into little objects and subjects if you all come from the same force, energy force, without getting too deep into the spiritual thing. And again, by spiritual, I don't mean anything religious at all.
Mhm.
Just
Let
to
me
say-
piggyback very briefly on what Joyce is saying, but I want to do this from by speaking of creating from a vibrational space. And it also is tying in back with something that, that Tom was mentioning around the spirit, which also relates to the way in which we vibrate in the world. And, I've been playing a lot with what I call archetypal energies, but the vibrational things that out of which we create things are operating basically on two principles. I mean, we create either through trying to create harmony, or we have disharmony. The other way it happens is that there's balance and imbalance in that vibrational space. Now, when I think about that, then I go to what is it that we bring to a particular situation, both in our heads and in our hearts, about a kind of a mindset. It could be a mental mindset, but also a heart mindset. And from that vibrational space, there are, in my mind, in a way, certain foundational things that relate to what I'm going to term as inner power, and getting in touch with our inner power to make things happen. So at a simplistic, maybe complex way of talking about it, I think about certain things that I call foundational inner power, and a mindset that's related to that. So there's an inner power for security. That's a mindset for inviting, for example, trust. There's an inner power for our sensory experiences. And that's a mindset for being enthusiastic, for allowing humor, for serving or seeing beauty, for being hopeful. And then there's some transformational inner power that relates to mindsets. And I think about that as our inner power for transformation. And those relate to mindsets for love, mindsets for abundance, a mindset for acceptance, and a mindset for harmony. And then there's some mindsets that relate to an inner power for inspirational, what I call inspirational connectedness. And that's a mindset for understanding, speaking your truth, sharing your wisdom, being patient, sharing inspirational thoughts and feelings. And then there's something that I call like our spiritual integrative inner power. It's a whole set of those. And it has to do with the inner power for altruism. That's a mindset for inviting abundance, being compassionate, promoting peace, experiencing joy, seeking clarity, and having a nurturing vision. And then there's an inner power for what I call our soul source connection. Now that's a mindset for recognizing our oneness and promoting unity and experiencing serenity. Now just imagine a world where you bring those kinds of mindsets. If you happen to find yourself in a delegated leadership role, or one that you simply bring with you in whatever context you happen to be in. Those kinds of mindsets. Then you're involved with creating a whole new experience, not only for yourself, but those around you too, and inviting people into that experience through the way of what Dean calls being. Because if you're being these things through the kind of leadership roles that you find yourself in, or the experiences that you find yourself in, that mindset, those mindsets then are carried forward. I'm going to tie this in also in with something else Dean was referring to, which is systems impact. Because systems actually are held in place by the people who are in the systems with certain kind of mindsets. It's not accidental that the systems are the way they are. They are that way because people have certain kind of mindsets. And so the kind of work that people who are in the consulting business can do is helping those who happen to find themselves in those roles to take a look at the mindsets that they're engaged in. I'll give you a simple example of this. Before I got into the world of academia, I was also in the role of, I worked with a number of consulting firms. And one of the consulting firms was with Charles Hamilton and Associates. And Chuck and I sat down one day and said, you know, one of the ways that we can try to help to make a difference is to come up with what we call critical concepts. And we don't have to tell the people that we're working with that these critical concepts really are at play. We just talk to them. So this one consulting business, it was with Boston Edison companies, with these executives. And we were asked to come in because they were having some issues with staff and so forth. And there were some racial related issues and so forth. And we just sat down with the president of the executive president of the company, and we were just talking with him. But we were very consciously using these concepts. Like, for example, we might say, you know, what you're experiencing here are people having people problems. It's a simple concept, and that requires inviting and setting a tone, you know, for trust. Now, we didn't say, we just repeated these things. So then we said, would you mind us videotaping you? Because he couldn't attend all of the training sessions that we were having. And so we videotaped him. We didn't tell him what to say, or what have you. So in this videotape, what this executive started talking about, he says, you know, we're experiencing now a lot of people problems. And what we need to do is to create a climate for trust. We need to create a climate for collaboration. You know, all of the words, there were about 10 to 15 of these critical concepts that we were using. And we were just talking to him behind closed doors, just using those concepts. Now, the managers that we were putting this training program, we were operationalizing this training program through, were listening to this tape, and they began to use the same terminology and began to explain how that actually got manifested in their work life or not, where things were breaking down, and then began to change the climate within the whole system that was there. So there are ways in which this can be done if people have certain kind of mindsets. And if you happen to find yourself in a consulting role with people who are sitting in these seats of authority, do certain simple things like introducing certain kinds just through your talking, critical concepts. When I was dean, for example, there were other little simple things that I did. I followed a dean who was very standoffish. People couldn't communicate with him, and so forth. One of the simple things that I did, and it was very unwelcoming, is I did a simple thing like putting a welcome mat in front of my door, keeping my door open so that people could come in and out. Changed the entire climate, of that particular school system. It's college that I was a dean of. So operating, when you're conscious about these things, you can change things without being so heavy-handed about it, and you can make a difference. So that's just a point that I just wanted to try to share with people.
Well, I have to admit that dialogues continue to fascinate me. It's like going to church, isn't it? I mean, we have all of these voices in the choir, and in the end, we come a little closer to connecting with one another and with the people that we're talking to, and we come a little closer to creating greater understanding in some really important ways. And we're coming to the end of this dialogue, and I just want to tell you how grateful I am to each one of you for being a voice in the choir today and bringing the wisdom and the depth and the experience that each of you has. And Tom, I guess it's time to invite Jim back in for a close. But really, deepest appreciation. I know as I read the voices in the chat how grateful everyone is for the presence and the being and the heart that you've each shared today. So thank you. Jim?
George, thank you all. I'm conscious at the time, but I know one of the questions that was being asked in the Q&A box was around the evolution of empathy and the importance of empathy in both consciousness and in leadership. So I think that's a question worth pondering. The comment that I would make is along the following lines. And it was, I think, triggered by your question, George, about, what is leadership? What should leadership be in a time of code red? And Celeste and Joyce made some comments that triggered the following thought in me that I'd like to just put into the hopper. I was thinking, what is consciousness? How would we really define it? For leadership, we have some sense about, but consciousness is one of the most elusive phenomena because we're like the goldfish in the water. We can't define the water because we're in the water. And I just recently, I was reading a book on Tibetan Buddhist mysticism. And the Tibetan language has more words for consciousness than any other language in the world. Sort of like the Eskimos have, multiple dozens of words for snow. And so I was interested to learn that for the Tibetans, who have studied consciousness probably more deeply than maybe anybody, they say that what constitutes consciousness is the combination of awareness and memory. And that seems a little bit counterintuitive, because normally when you think of consciousness, you think of awareness. But for the Tibetans, they believe that it is awareness coupled with memory that constitutes consciousness, because in their understanding of consciousness, as one becomes more aware, one then begins to have the capacity for deeper memory. And Celeste, when you were talking about, the woman who sees in the dark, and Joyce, when you were talking about we've got to go back, what I think for me is coming up out of this conversation and in just general reflections about leadership in Code Red is to have to, in all of our modernity and technical sophistication, possibly the wisest thing we could do is just go back to our primordial mind, back to the indigenous mind, back to the farthest that we can actually remember as individuals and as a community, because it is that capacity to remember as far back as we can in the awareness of the current challenges that will give us the sagacity to make the kinds of decisions that we need to make in order to save ourselves. So I just wanted to bring in that notion of consciousness as awareness and memory, because I think it's fundamental. And it's worth noting that the Buddha was called awake. He was fully aware, and he could remember every single one of his past lives.
Jim, I'd love to add a storyline to that beautiful story. For me, what you're speaking to is that consciousness is ever present in both lines of time, right? Timelessness and timestamps of history. And memory is, for me, talking about, well, in one of those lines, timestamps of what's gone before. If consciousness is fluid and process, ever present, always moving, always arising, then what's coming next is also something to consider adding to the storyline of awareness and memory and possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's coming next is the infinite possibility. And I see that with the word empathy, in that I think one of the major breakthroughs that needs to happen in the awake, aware community on the planet is to realize that our code red doesn't mean that the planet or we are broken. It's just the expression of consciousness expressing through billions of people, these on the planet right now, manifesting in the way it's manifested systems and through my own inner experience. And it's simply a wake-up call to get busy co-creating from the place of oneness, where empathy is born, lives, and thrives, where we are in this together in an evolutionary journey to simply create the next possibility for humanity. And so I love the idea of thinking of the essence of me as consciousness, going back in time, memory, going forward in time, possibility. And now I just want to get busy. Let's go work together, man. Let's play. Let's do it. Let's bring our stuff to the party, man. Let's co-create a world that works for everyone. So let's get busy.
Yeah. So we're pushing past the time, but I'd love to just hear Celeste, Cuff, and Joyce just take a minute and just what's coming up for you as we bring this to a close, and then George, and then Tom, if you could tee us up for tomorrow. But this has been so rich, everyone. It's a precious time. Celeste.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. What's coming up for me is gratitude and joy, actually, if I source that, for these things. Dean, you have more energy that comes through this screen than most people can pull off authentically, and it's beautiful to me. And Cuff, I don't know that I have experienced such a congruent kind of an expression of empathy on Zoom ever. Your pacing and leading and your quiet, clear presence is accessible. And Joyce, I just want to get to know you more. I just so love what you say and your passion, and the collection of you. For me, this is a very private, personal response, Jim, is just you lift me up. I forget sometimes that we still have hope. And that's what you brought to me. And that's what I take into my day and the work I have before me. And for those of you, Jim and George and Tom and the team that supports this effort, real gratitude for your stamina and your commitment.
Thank you, Celeste. That was a beautiful thing to say. That was
I
beautiful.
have a
Thank
lot
you.
of hope, and that's why I'll never get rid of my name, Hope. Please always use it, never leave it out. I'm just totally always amazed by the students that I teach and work with every day. The moments of the epiphanies, I will call them, that they have, and something has been touched deep inside of them. And I'm so impressed because I think, oh, this is probably something they don't remember, they don't know anything about, they won't be able to attach to. This is why I am so clearly committed to what I'm calling, what some of us are calling rematriation, as the route to planet repairs, as the route to the empathy that we're talking about, the emphatic leadership that we need to have. I'm also, when I look at the way my students operate, I see that they believe a lot in collaboration, that they want to form groups and to see what the other person has to say. I'm very clear, for me, I'm totally committed to the notion that the consensus model, first of all, which insists on appreciation, embrace of everyone into the circle of contribution, is the way that will move forward. And maybe it's naivete or whatever, but I feel that the humanity that Ubuntu requires, which is a very fundamental notion among human beings, no matter what culture, that harmony ultimately is what we really want. And it's the thing that's going to, in fact, ensure that we survive, and that sooner or later we'll get, and maybe not one expression of a model, but many expressions of the models of beingness, if you want, I'd like to call that word, of humanity, that it extends from one to the other. And the ultimate realization is that I'm human only because you are, and because I can connect to you as another human being. There is no other way that we as people can call ourselves human beings. We have to realize that I'm only human because you are. And that is the fundamental consciousness, I think, that we as people, and that anyone who proclaims to be a leader or wants to be a part of a leadership mission, certainly it's what I believe in, will be successful. So.
Yeah, I'm human because you're human. That's the bottom line. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you. Cuff, do you have any just final quick note?
Yeah, what's coming up for me is just the experience of gratitude. But I'm also, what's coming up is a reminder. Jim, when you talked about the Tibetan, the thing between what consciousness is and memory, and I went, oh yeah. I've actually been provided with an opportunity to know some of my past lives. And they have informed a lot of what I've been doing in the world. And I'm grateful for that. These are past lives that are related to this life, other past lives that are not related to this life. And so that gratitude, for when I got exposed to the past lives and how they have informed what I do now, I'm extraordinarily grateful for all of that. And I'm also extraordinarily grateful for all of the ancestors who have served as guides. And those who are, one may not necessarily think about as, well, I guess they are ancestors, but I know, for example, that I do have a spiritual guide that a lot of people know. Sri Aurobindo is one of my spiritual guides. And Michael is one of my spiritual guides. Mm. And I'm grateful for that. And then I say to myself, when all is said and done, when all of our red things are done with, we all know that it all stems from and flows right back to love. We know that, but we forget. And that is something that we need to be reminded of over and over and over again. And what leaders, conscious leaders, need to keep inviting into the space from which they operate. Those are my words.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. George?
I've said all I need to. It's been a beautiful experience. I do, as I say, I really am beginning to believe that these forms of inquiry are a form of church, and I'm grateful to be a part of them and look forward to the next.
Thank you. Tom?
I'll share a couple of things real quick. One is that, as we're creating the container for the week, in this case, conscious leadership, the last week was on the youth mental health crisis. There's an intentionality that we bring to it, and then we extend the invitation to the panelists, and then magic happens. Mm. And I just want to honor each of you and the magicians that you are and the magic that we were able to co-create today. So thank you each for bringing your gifts, your life experience, your talent, your perspective to a wonderful dialogue today. It was beyond what I had hoped or thought we could co-create. So thank you. It's been a wonderful dialogue today. Tomorrow we have two extraordinary leaders who've been celebrated and recognized for their the work that they're doing. Bob Chapman, CEO of a company called Barry Weinmiller. And through Bob's tenure in leadership, he has created what he has termed truly human leadership. And with his $13,000, $3 billion plus organization, has created a culture that's celebrated for recognizing that each of the leaders have individuals under their span of care, not span of control. Each of those individuals are somebody's precious child. And the culture that he's created has been a wildly financially successful company, but more importantly, and something that Bob is most proud of, is that those individuals, as they leave the workplace each day, bring that perspective, that attitude, that care to their homes and to their communities. Our other leader that we have is Jason Lippert of Lippert Industries. And Jason, like Bob, has been celebrated for the focus and attention and care he's given to organization leadership and organization culture, recognizing that each of us, when we leave our workplaces every day, go home to our families and to our communities. And they both are leading from that place, creating wildly financially successful, celebrated on Wall Street companies, but more importantly, in the personal lives of each of those individuals and the communities they live in. So we'll have an opportunity to spend time tomorrow with two very celebrated, recognized leaders for leading in a very different way from what we traditionally see in business.
Thank you, Tom. George, it's been a pleasure working with you to develop this, and Joyce and Cuff and Celeste, Dean. There's been something, Tom's right. There's been deep magic here. You've created an elixir, and I just want to acknowledge it. I feel refreshed by it. I feel inspired by it. And Celeste, your affirmation of everyone was so beautiful. It catalyzed the magic. And I just want to acknowledge your generosity of spirit as we close today, and the wisdom of all of you. It's a beautiful thing. 499 days and we're still going. This is what the world needs, everybody. This is what the world needs. So thank you all. I'm deeply, deeply grateful. And that brings us to a close, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box. And we'll see you tomorrow for day 3 of a 4-session program on conscious leadership. We all need to lead, and we all need to be conscious about how we lead. And that exploration and that embodiment is of singular importance to whether our generation makes those decisions necessary to ensure an abundant future. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Thank you.